Good morning, good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Carter Q, and I'm an adult services librarian here at the historic Stanford L. Warren Branch Library. Wanted to thank you for taking the time from your very busy schedules. Of course, I know that if it's been a little drier, you may have been out in your gardens, and of course it's nice and cool today and been extremely hot over the past several days, so I know you were reticent to go out into your gardens. But wanted to just thank you for being here again today. We have had a wonderful session. How many of you have come to some of the other sessions that are part of the Hattie Meadows Gardening School? Great, great. Just wanted to say a few words about Hattie Meadows, who's just a fabulous woman who lived here at 601 Fayetteville Street, 601 Linwood, which is just round the corner from Stanford Warren. And Hattie Meadows was a 30-year cafeteria manager at the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company. But she had a 40 by 70 garden plot that was just here, and she had a koi pond. I read about her in the 1950s, in 1953, in the Durham Herald Sun. And there's this woman that not many people knew about, but she had over 70 varieties of roses. She had azaleas, she had perennials, and she had fruit trees as well. But can you imagine, how many of you knew anybody that had a koi pond growing up? She had her koi pond in the 1950s. So, one thing I told Kavana that I always like to say in memory of Hattie Meadows, and if she was sitting here right now, I would say, I want you to repeat after me. Hattie Meadows.
Hattie Meadows
was a gardener.
was a gardener.
Hattie Meadows.
Hattie Meadows
was a gardener.
was a gardener.
I
will
continue
the
legacy of Hattie Meadows. I want to bring forward my colleague from the Sarah P. Duke Gardens, Kavana Anderson.
All right, welcome again, everyone. I'm Kavana Anderson. I'm the Director of Learning and Community Engagement at Duke Gardens, and I am here to say how much of a wonderful collaboration the Hattie Meadows Gardening School series is and has been. So it's a partnership between Stanford L. Warren Library, really Carter Q, and Duke Gardens, and the North Carolina Cooperative Extension. So Ashley Troth, who coordinates all of the Durham County Master Gardeners, is our other partner who's not here with us today, but important to make sure that she's represented. I will share that the mission of Duke Gardens is to inspire transformative learning, support wellness, and build community. And this program does all three of those things. So it's such a pleasure to work together across these three organizations to bring these programs to you. Thank you all for being here. And thank you to our incredible speaker for being here today. I'm going to introduce him. I heard from some people in the crowd that you came knowing who the speaker was. You didn't even need to know what the topic is. You know it's going to be good if it's Bryce Lane, who is a local garden celebrity. Has anyone in the audience heard Bryce Lane speak before? All right. So a couple people who know what they're in for, and then also a lot of people who are in for a new treat. So Bryce Lane is a professor emeritus from North Carolina State, the Department of Horticulture. He has so many honors and awards, I can't name them all. And then he also is the former host and producer of the UNC TV show In the Garden with Bryce Lane, that is a 3-time Emmy award-winning show. Yeah. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Bryce Lane, who's going to share the history of gardening with us. Thank you so much for being here.
Good morning. So let's reset the table, shall we? Thank you for that introduction. I am a husband who has been married for 49 years. So next year I got to figure out something really special to do. I have 2 daughters who are married, both live in Raleigh, and each have 3 children. So I have 6 grandchildren, ranging in ages from 19 to 10. And that may be way more important. I know it's way more important than having 3 Emmy statues in my home office in my sunroom. My grandchildren could care less about that I had a television show, or they could even care less about those Emmys. In fact, I probably should have put a slide in. If you could see them today, this morning, they're on the top of the bookshelf. I sit in my office like this. They're on the top of the bookshelf, and I use it to dry my baseball caps. That's about how good they are. So I know my place, right? It's an honor. Carter, Kavana, and Ashley, who decided to go to the beach instead of come here for this presentation. I've known Ashley a while, but no, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here and to have the opportunity to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, and that's gardening. History, on the other hand, was never one of my favorite topics, especially as a younger man going through school. And the older I've gotten, the more interested and the more intrigued I've become with the concept of history. And I think those of us that have more mileage behind us than what we may have left might tend to agree that all of a sudden history starts to play a major role. I have a younger brother, and he could care less that I'm into Ancestry.com. And I'll say, Brian, you got to look at I've got this whole thing. We're going back to 1500. And he's like, oh, that's nice. And he doesn't really embrace that. And so I'm thrilled to be able to be here to talk to you about the history of gardening, how cultures, events, and people make gardening what it is today. Before I do that, though, Carter, thanks for having us repeat after you, because I feel, and you'll see in a minute, I feel that I might be horticultural kin to Hattie Meadows, in that I too have a very small garden with lots of different kinds of plants in it, and I've got a few slides to show that. So, are you ready? Yeah. I have been challenged with taking an 8-week class at the J.C. Ralston Arboretum, that I teach classes at the Ralston Arboretum. I taught a course that had this very title. It was an 8-week class that met 2 hours every Monday night. And so I've been challenged, I have the challenge of taking that 8-week class and condensing it into less than 2 hours. So put on your horticultural seatbelts. Carter, is there any way these canned lights could go out? If not, no, not a problem. Just a little bit of no worries there. So I've been told, Kavana told me that I was going to offer up the PowerPoint slides in the form of a PDF if you sent me an email. However, I'm going to turn over a PDF copy to Ashley and Kavana and Carter, and they're going to make it available to you all. Okay? So that way, if some of you are here to be taking notes, fear not. Fear not. Okay, are you ready to get started? Carter, this is fine. This is fine. Okay, so a little history about me. I'm not from around these parts. Okay, I came to Raleigh, North Carolina in August of 1981. Okay, at the time I was called a damn Yankee because I grew up in the Northeast. And I grew up in a little town where the University of Massachusetts is located in Western Massachusetts, called Amherst, Massachusetts. Now, when I was growing up, it was not uncommon for me to spend lots of time outdoors. Growing up in the 60s, you were an outdoor kid. You didn't even have a choice. You'd come home from school, you'd change your clothes, and you'd go right back outside, and your mother would say, be home by dark. And that was the extent of the supervision that I received as a kid growing up. And I suspect that certainly played a great role in me having a love for the natural world and for horticulture in general. But typically, there'd be a snowstorm in the middle of the wintertime, and the schools would be closed. And after that 15, 16-inch snowstorm, we would all want to go outside and meet our friends out in the neighborhood. And my mom, even at 12 years old, my mom made me wear one of those. Okay? It's called a snowsuit. And it is something that a 12-year-old boy does not want to wear because all his peers are wearing blue jeans and a jacket and a pair of gloves. I, on the other hand, was required to wear the snowsuit and wear the mittens that my mother had knitted, okay, that had a connection from one mitten to the other so they wouldn't get lost. Can you imagine how embarrassing it was for a 12-year-old to walk out? And you could hear me coming because those snowsuits, you could hear me coming, right? And we go out and we start to play, and in about 20 minutes, my friends' pants would be so wet, their hands would be so cold that they would go back inside. That left me out alone, okay, in this cold, because typically after a snowstorm up in Massachusetts, it gets very cold and windy. I would go down to the pond behind my house, and I'd lay down underneath these white pines, not these specifically, but under white pines. Okay, there was a big pond behind my house, a field, there were white pine trees along the base, and I would make snow angels under those pines. Now, I'm a 12-year-old boy who is alone, okay? If my friends had been with me, there wouldn't have been any snow angels being made at all, but I would lay there and make snow angels, and I would listen to the sound of the wind blow through the needles of the white pine being Pinus strobus. Who knew that I would ultimately know the scientific name, and I would teach a class at NC State called plant identification. And so that I'd be teaching white pine as Pinus strobus, and I would talk about identification features like the sympodial branching that you see here. Sympodial branching just means that the branches all come out to form what looks like a wagon wheel, right? And that the leaves, and then of course the cones would have resin dripping from it. I can still smell it on my hands today. Okay, I can still remember my mom getting mad at me because I'd get it all over my hands and my clothing. Some of you are nodding your heads. All right, and who knew that I'd be teaching Pinus strobus as a pine that has 5 needles per fascicle, 5 long green needles with a white stripe that runs down. All those things consistent within the context. I wasn't really sure. You couldn't have asked me. It wasn't at that time as a kid. I'm going, someday I'm going to be a teacher of horticulture, but that was the beginning of my journey. The second part of my journey was when I was 16 years old, in 1973. Some of you are working the math right now. My father told me I had to pay for half my college education. Now, my answer to my dad was, well, who said I'm going to college? That was the wrong answer. And so after he realigned my motivation, I found myself looking for my first part-time job. It was either at the left of Independent Garden Center in the adjacent town I lived in called the Hadley Garden Center, or at one of those things called the McDonald's. And I tell my students that I teach at NC State, I'm still teaching part-time there, that yes, they did have McDonald's back when I was 16 years old. McDonald's job was French fryer. I would have to sit there in front of the French fryer and fry French fries all day long. Or at the Hadley Garden Center, come on in, at the Hadley Garden Center, it was loading cars. I was a car loader, and so I took the job at the Hadley Garden Center for one reason and one reason only. Oh, you love plants and you were in the garden. No, I took it because I was an outdoor kid, and I'd rather be outdoors than indoors. And so I ended up working at the Hadley Garden Center as a car loader, but just to give us some perspective, these are the prices at McDonald's in 1973. Okay, just a little bit of perspective. A quarter pounder with cheese was a whopping 70 cents. Okay, so my job was to load cow manure, 6 cubic foot bales and 4 cubic foot bales of peat moss, dolomitic limestone that got me white with lime. People would buy their materials, and then a buzzer would ring. I'd run to the front of the store. They'd tell me how many bags Mrs. Jones needed, and I'd go and I'd wait at the pallets of the bags, and she'd back in. And I was such a good car loader that people asked for me. I could take 2 50-pound bags of cow manure and lift it over the trunk latch so it wouldn't rip the bag and put it in the, I got promoted. I did. I got promoted to fruit tree potter. That meant I got to pot up fruit trees and then merchandise them back in the nursery, because fruit trees were some of the trees that were first sold in the beginning of the year. And so I was so good at fruit tree potting and merchandising, I got my fruit tree sales. And when I got promoted to fruit tree sales, I went from a pair of blue jeans and a t-shirt to khaki pants and a green Hadley Garden Center shirt with my name embroidered over the top. That made me an instant expert overnight. So for me, what you're going to hear today is really started by the actual practical education I got by working 7 years through high school and college at a garden center. And then the theoretical knowledge came afterwards. And you know what? I actually think that may be a better recipe than teaching the theory first and then the practice. But that's a personal opinion. Okay. I can remember I got promoted to nursery sales, and I would ask, one of the first questions we'd always ask our customers coming in, can I help you with something? And they'd say, yes, I'm looking for some shrubs for the front of my house. And so the next question was, what direction does your house face? I was trained well. Okay. Number one answer, toward the street. Yes. So how do you deal with that if you're waiting on customers? So I got kind of humorous. I would say, well, ma'am, all these plants over here to the left of the greenhouse are plants that will grow on the side of your house that faces the street, and all these will not. Okay. Now that was a joke that just went all the way over, hit the wall, and came back. Okay. So yeah, that I had to learn how to answer questions and ask and answer questions like that. I, like Hattie Meadows, I'm also a small space gardener. I live in a house that I bought back in 1983. So I've lived in the same house and gardened in the same place for 43 years. Talk about history of gardening. I have a history of gardening. The average American lives in their home on most Americans live on an average 7 years. What kind of horticultural gardening continuity can we get in 7 years? I've watched trees grow, I've watched them die, and I've watched them be replaced, all in the same place, a little quarter-acre plot. And so come on in. So what I've learned is, and what I've done is, I've killed all the plants that I've ever killed in one place. Now notice, I didn't say I killed all my plants in that one place, but I do have what I think as a gardener a pretty good track record. I would say any plants I bring home and plant, roughly 15% die and 85% live. That's not a bad. Okay, my next door neighbor is a born-again gardener. Okay, never gardened before, and then he's lived there since 1988. Finally, one night he knocks on my door and he says, I want to be a gardener. I'll say, go back to bed. I'll see you in the morning. But my neighbor Dan tells me the most important thing he's ever learned from me as a gardener is death spells opportunity. Right? And so death is part of gardening, and it's one we need to embrace just as much as the life that we get. Although I have to tell you, I'm on a big white oak grow white oaks from seed. I'm on a big campaign for growing white oaks from seed. I have over 150 white oaks I've grown from seed. Oh wait, now it's 147 because the squirrels, okay, I've had to figure out, I spend countless hours trying to figure out how to outsmart those guys, okay? So I don't typically wear this when I garden. That's more my garden outfit, okay? And when I think of my garden, I think about the good, the bad, and the ugly. Okay, by the way, I teach 18 to 24-year-old students in a course called Home Horticulture, right? And I show them that slide, and they are totally clueless. I'm like, don't you remember this movie? Yeah. What movie? Don't you know who that is? Nope, they don't. And so when I think about my garden, I think about things that I've done that are good, some that are pretty bad, and then we won't talk about the ugly things that I've done in my garden, okay? So this inspired me. I got my wife to come out, and I said, I need you to take some photos of me to kind of encompass this whole idea of good, bad, and ugly. So she came out, she took my photo. All right, she says, okay, she said, first of all, what's with the toothpick? And I said, the toothpick is the closest I'll ever get to tobacco. I have a very bad relationship with tobacco, and so as a result, I put the toothpick in, and she said, and what's with the soil knife? I said, well, that's my weapon of choice. Okay, she said, by the way, who are you trying to look like? And I said, Clint Eastwood. She said, it ain't happening. Okay, but in this case, I actually have my soil knife and my pair of pruners, and here I am in one iteration of my backyard garden. So when I think about history, I think about the history of my own gardening experience in my own backyard, but what has created the science that I teach and the gardening that I've experienced? What has created that result? It's the people, it's the cultures, it's the events and the places of yesterday. Okay, it's that historical underpinning that ultimately makes me the gardener I am today. And so today, the whole idea is that we would embrace history. Now, I wrote in my little book there's no way we can talk about all these things, because I tell you this much, I got this book recently, okay? A History of Horticulture in America up to 1860, all right? Now, everything that's in here is nothing that I teach in my history of gardening class. holy smokes, I think I've got to create a whole nother class that talks specifically about American gardening. So because history's everywhere. I'm in East Flat Rock, North Carolina, visiting a turf grower for the TV show that we did. We're going to do a thing on showing people how turf gets grown in North Carolina. And he takes me up to his home on the top of a mountain. And he goes, hey, I got to show you something. And he takes me over and he shows me this. Wow. Okay. And he says, do you recognize that? I said, well, it's obviously a white oak. I could tell that it was a white oak. Grows up over and up like that. And he says, do you know how that happened? And I said, I haven't a clue. He said, well, picture this as a seedling that's about this tall, all right, a young seedling that somebody takes and bends, ties a string to it or a rope to it and to a rock down there, and then lets it follow. And that's how they created that. I said, somebody did that, or did that happen because a storm came and a tree fell down? He said, no, somebody did that. And I said, who? Okay. Who? Well, the main most accepted theory about this is these are actually GPS units that have been placed all throughout North America by native peoples as a way to get from one village to another village to another village. And if you ever saw one of these, this is how it was made. You can see the sapling oak or maple here bends over, it's tied down, it turns up, and then that's saying they bent it in the direction that the trail takes to either water, food, settlement, that type of thing. And so here we have these living historical markers, all right? Someday, okay, maybe what we should do is bury our phones in the ground. That way, when somebody finds them, they'll say, what on earth is this thing? This is how the ancient peoples used to get from one place to another or to communicate. So history's everywhere. And so what I'm going to try to do this morning, quickly and briefly, is take you on some horticultural snapshots through the course of human history, right? Not all, it's not comprehensive. It can't even begin to be comprehensive because I myself haven't become comprehensively aware of all the history of horticulture that's out there. But what's the ultimate purpose? I'm a professional educator. My job is to teach you something you didn't know before, inspire you. I really believe people make decisions more based on feelings than they do on facts. We know that, don't we? All we have to do is watch the news, okay? And then, but moreover, that maybe today's presentation, maybe today's experience will change you'll change your gardening behavior. I don't know how, but hopefully it will, because if it does, that's great. If it doesn't, then I will have failed you. But this is really kind of a historical, inspirational talk so that we can go home and feel more grounded, no pun intended, in the gardening activities that we do. Because I think as gardeners, you know, for me, I get up in the morning, we're the most optimistic people on earth, are we not? We walk out into our gardens and say, it's going to work today. And then it doesn't. And we say, that's okay, it'll work tomorrow. So typically these were white oaks, and there are over 2,000 documented trees in the southeast region of the country alone that have been bent like this. Over 2,000, which I think is amazing, okay? I can't begin to capture all the history, all right? But how cool it is that we're here today because of an historical person in Durham who created a garden that inspired people and also caused others maybe to garden. So a series of snapshots talking about cultures, events, and people. All right. Now, first of all, I got to clear the air. When I say gardening, most Americans say vegetables. But when I say gardening, my gardening is more using plants in outdoor spaces for a wide range of reasons. You could even include outdoor and indoor spaces. In other words, if you're a European gardener, if you go to a Swiss home and you say, show me your garden, they show you everything. It's trees, shrubs, vines, ground covers, ornamentals, flowers, containers, vegetables, and fruit trees, all in the same, all mixed in together. Okay, so when I talk about gardening, I'm talking about all of those, even the herbs you have across the front of your windowsill, all right? And let's make sure we all understand this word horticulture comes from two Latin words, hortus, which is really talking about the garden or plants, and culturare, which means to cultivate or take care of. So we have to start thinking about the history of horticulture. The history of gardening is the history of people taking care of plants, okay? So we look at, agriculturally speaking, we look and we say, okay, first, people were wanderers. Why were they wanderers and nomads? They were wanderers and nomads because they were not gardeners. Gardening had not entered their existence. And so what did they have to do? They had to go from one place to another, hunt things and gather things in order to sustain themselves, okay? And it wasn't until some of those nomads realized that the refuse pile where they threw all the bones of the animals and all the what was left over of the plants that they picked and ate, and they made a pile, all of a sudden they noticed that there were plants growing out of that pile. And so it was like, wait a minute, what if we can plant these seeds and we wouldn't have to move so frequently? That was the beginning of civilization as we know it. Make sense? Okay, who were those nomads? Who can we thank for being able to live in one place and actually garden? First horticulturists on earth were women.
Oh,
Women.
well,
Okay. I rest my case. All right, so first let's cover the ancient people, shall we? Let's look at the ancient Egyptians, 3500 to 300 BCE. Ancient Greeks, 400 to 200 BCE. Rome from 500 BCE to 500 CE. And then let's not forget Asian history sometimes gets second billing because it's not in the Fertile Crescent, as we call it, that area with the Tigris, Euphrates, and Nile rivers. Anyway, we're going to run through this really quick because I want to show you how ancient Egyptians created some technology that we still use today, followed by the Greeks, followed by the Romans, and even the Asians. So, ancient Egypt, okay, Nile Valley, technology that was developed, gardening technology, okay, agricultural technology that was developed. They were the first to come up with, hey, if we actually prepared the land a little bit, we'd have more success. We go, well, duh. Remember, we are standing on the backs of ancient peoples that figured it out. Okay? We know that by doing some level of cultivation and bed preparation, we're going to get better growth. They were just figuring that out. Secondly, using irrigation using hydraulics. The ancient Egyptians actually figured out ways to get water from one place to the next in order to feed the plants that they were, or to provide water for the plants that they were growing. And third, pruning techniques. That great thing we know as pruning, the thing I love to do probably more than most of you, because anytime I go and give a pruning workshop, everyone's like, I don't know if I should be pruning this now. And I'm like, go after it. And they're like, it's more of a mental health issue than it is a technology. But the Egyptians they actually learned more about how to go about training and pruning plants. All right? Now, check it out. Crops that were actually cultivated in ancient Egypt: date, fig, olive, and onion. Interestingly, many of the plants that we grow even today in our own vegetable gardens were staple foods back then. Grape was the backbone of ancient horticulture. Just you go deep into the Bible, the grape is everywhere. It's considered the backbone of ancient horticulture. Thank you, wine. And then by 3000 BCE, crops included things like lemons, endive, garlic. Those crops as well came along. By 1500 BCE, the first pleasure gardens, or landscape gardens as we know them, that included pools and privacy, hedges and screens, okay, showed up even back then. Now, at this point, from an historical perspective, please understand that pleasure gardens were pretty much possessed by the royalty and the wealthy, and specifically the wealthy. And that didn't change until almost it just left my head. It happens a lot now. The Industrial Revolution, okay, when people didn't have to work all day long to feed themselves, okay? And ancient Egypt is responsible for the perfume some of you may be wearing today, or the cologne, okay? The perfume and spices that we put on our food started then. Does anybody know why these started back in ancient Egypt? There's two reasons why the perfume and spice horticulture started back in ancient Egypt. And so, in fact, most people when they come to a presentation like this only remember 10% of what they heard. And I'm hoping this will be part of it. Okay, I hope when you leave, you'll go home and you'll tell somebody, did you know that? So here it is. Here's why. Because people stunk and food went bad. Okay? So first of all, people stunk. Okay, so hygiene, okay, ancient Egypt. Okay, you didn't take a bath every day. You didn't shower in the morning, shower in the evening before you went to bed. Okay, that kind of hygiene didn't exist back in ancient Egypt. And so what you did is you just covered up the old bad smell as long as you could. In fact, I think up until, gosh, even colonial times, people would bathe once a year. I know it's hard to wrap my head around that. All right, so people use perfume to hide the stinky smells. Otherwise, okay, there was no procreation. Okay. Secondly, food went bad. There was no refrigeration. So sometimes you'd be cooking with something that might be on the edge, and you wanted to hide the bad smell that was coming. And so spices provided you with that ability to feed your kids things they wouldn't. Mom, this smells. No, it doesn't. That's the spice. Okay, so that was the reason. All right, let's jump to ancient Asia. All right, Chinese were horticultural innovators. They did a lot of new things. Okay, the cast iron hoe was invented in China. The cast iron hoe, this cultivating term. Sidebar. Okay, when you teach 18 to 24-year-olds in the 21st century and you start talking about hoes in the garden, they see an entirely different thing than you're trying to communicate to them. I'm trying to stay relevant, but it's really hard. Okay, so the cast iron hoe. The one-wheeled wheelbarrow was invented in 1000 CE in the Han Dynasty, the one-wheel wheelbarrow. It's like now you can say, hey, do you know where the wheelbarrow came from? And we still use those today. Now we use them where they have no wooden tires, but they actually have tires that don't even need to be inflated. Okay, Confucius wrote a lot about gardening as far back as 500 BCE. Peach, plum, melons, Chinese cabbages were all common plants that people grew in their gardens, and even ornamental trees like Prunus mume, the Japanese apricot, which was 25, 30 years ago introduced to North Carolina by the late J.C. Ralston of NC State University, okay, a tree that flowers in February and is fragrant, okay, is a plant that is somewhat popular, but not totally popular. Why? Because most people don't frequent garden centers in January. And so as a result, you have to be actually educated to know that you want one. Whereas there are other plants like rhododendron, you walk into a garden center in May and pow, there they are in full flower, and you're buying them and you don't even know anything about them. So picture this, China 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, okay, there were a large group of individuals called Chinese poets and philosophers. Okay, now the job of a Chinese poet and philosopher was to figure out the secret to eternal life. That was their job. They were hired to do that. Okay, so here we go. Okay, gives you a little bit of geographical information. Chinese poets and philosophers, they believed that the mountains, meditation, would lead to immorality. Immortality. Yeah, that probably too, okay. The idea was that the mountains held the power to eternal life, right? And so it was important to go to the mountains and meditate in order to figure out what the secret was to immortality, all right? So I want you to pretend that you're a Chinese poet and philosopher and you have to travel to the mountains. You've got to get up to where the tree line go, right at the tree line where the trees go away, right? Okay, you're a Chinese poet and philosopher. First of all, what do you see along the way? By the way, you're walking, okay? Okay, you're walking through nature, so that's your canvas, that's your backdrop. And then you get up at 6,000 feet, okay? And I want would you do a little exercise with me? Okay, I bet you didn't think you'd have to participate today. Okay, I'd like for you to pretend you're a Chinese poet and philosopher. You've made the trip. You're at 6,000 feet. You're sitting down on a rock, looking out over a valley. Close your eyes. Okay, so now scream out. What do you see? Things you see. Wild flowers and trees. Birds. Water, birds. Rice paddies. Okay, you got good eyes. Okay, okay. Guys, do you see that gnarled old tree right to the right where the roots are growing out between two rocks? And you see how it's been buffeted by the wind? Do you see that? Okay, you see you're walking in, you walk up the mountain, and there all of a sudden you see these old trees that are buffeted by the wind. Parts of them are alive, parts of them are dead. Okay? I mean, you can see, do you see where they might have gotten the idea that these old trees held the power of immortality? So guess what they did? Oh, I know. They ran home, they went to their local garden center, they bought a little tree, and they trained it into something that looked really old. No, they didn't do that. No, they didn't do that. No, what they did was they dug up the ones that were up in the mountain, and they brought it home. Now, these guys were poets and philosophers. They weren't gardeners. I can only imagine how many trees they killed, right? And they believed that the trees held the power to immortality. Well, guess what? They all died natural lives, natural length lives. They didn't live any longer, maybe a little bit from the exercise. Okay? And it was Buddhist monks that took this idea and brought it to the Japanese, and the Japanese said, oh, they're very contemplative. What we're going to do is we're actually going to take young trees and make them look old. And that was the birth of bonsai. Okay? All right? So a couple of things. One, I do that little exercise with third graders when we're talking about bonsai. I talk about the history of bonsai and whatnot. I have them all closing their eyes and saying, oh, I see a hawk, I see this. And they're all yelling. All of a sudden, there was quiet. And this one time, and all of a sudden, one kid from the back yelled, I see other Chinese poets and philosophers meditating. Yes. Okay? So it led to this. We can go to the National Arboretum, National Bonsai Collection. We can see hundreds and hundreds of these trees that have been literally trained to look old. And okay, so remember I said that the bonsai artists and the Chinese poets and philosophers, they all died normal lives. They didn't live any longer, so they were wrong about that, held the secret to immortality, all right? But here's proof positive that God has a sense of humor, okay? When you train a tree, a young tree, into something that looks old, it outlasts its natural life in the landscape by almost 10 times. So the bonsai are the ones that end up having immortality, if you will. You can go and see 500-year-old plants at the National Arboretum. You can see these old plants at the National Arboretum that when we celebrated, since it's our 250th anniversary, when we celebrated our 200th, okay, the country of Japan presented us with a 552-year-old bonsai, right, as a gift. I think they were rubbing our nose in it. I think they were saying, you guys think you're so old, 200 years. Here's a tree. Here's a houseplant for you, right? Here's a houseplant that's 3 times your age as a country. But what happens? We end up with movies like Karate Kid. 6th century Japanese Buddhists started with young trees, grown in small, shallow containers. These trees become part of the family tradition, okay? There's nothing more honorable, okay, for a Japanese grandfather or for a Japanese grandson or daughter to receive the bonsai that their grandfather received from their grandfather, okay? These are family heirlooms. So the scene in the movie, Karate Kid 2 or 3, where thugs came and just completely busted up the bonsai house, has way more feeling, and it's way more touching if you understand that history, that these bonsais, okay? And I asked the same third graders, I said, wouldn't you be excited if your grandfather gave you a bonsai? And one kid said, nope, I'd probably kill it. So there's that level of attitude. It's a cultural thing, Okay, now, we could spend today, tomorrow, and the next day talking about the Roman Empire, but that shows you the extent of the Roman Empire at its heyday, okay? But we're looking horticultural, 500 BCE to 500 CE. Look at this. There's an emphasis on practical agriculture and horticulture. Interesting, okay? Improved on Egyptian culture. In other words, they improved on irrigation, cultivation, pruning, and other things. Labor was not a problem, okay? Because the Romans enslaved everybody of the lands they conquered and created all these new technologies, okay? Yes? To a certain degree, I mean, that kind of actually, I suspect, this is an educated guess, I suspect that seeds as currency probably started in ancient Egypt to a certain degree, because that was what you valued that based on the potential that it would give you. But certainly a lot more. More innovations to culture. Who would have thought that the Romans would have come up with the idea of planting plants to enrich the soil? Oh, that's called green manure. That's where you're supposed to plant peas and plant legumes. But the Romans came up with that. Secondly, animal manure to improve soil structure. Animal manure. The idea that animal manure possessed a certain level of nutrition and would improve soil so crops would grow better. Okay? And we have written documentation. Just go to the Bible and look in Luke 13:18, where Jesus is giving this parable where he talks about the idea that this fig tree that's not being very productive needs to be cut down. The owner of the tree says it's got to be cut down, but the worker says, oh, let's give it one more year. I'm going to dig a little hole around it and add some manure. That's horticultural. Cultivation to manage weeds. The idea that this sarculum would be that cultivator, okay? I think it's interesting that Chinese had already figured that out, but then the Romans had to do it themselves, and so the sarculum became that in which they cultivated to control weeds. All right? In Rome, we're looking at hortus being defined as a kitchen garden near the home, okay? Lower class, that was their garden, their hortus was a little garden where they got food and herbs and medicines and things like that, where the horti was large-scale pleasure gardens that the wealthy had. So they actually delineated the two not only by what they grew, but also by the way they named it. And an ancient Roman villa, these were, by the way, these were weekend homes. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands how many have a beach house or a mountain house, but these were the weekend homes of the wealthy Romans, and they were out of the city, out of Rome. And guess what they were called? Suburbanum. Do you all see where the word suburban came from? Suburbia. Okay, wasn't a word we created. It was a word the Romans used to describe where they had their weekend homes, outside the city. Okay, if I wrote a book, it would be called The Birth of a Greenhouse. And it would be kind of overview of the history of the greenhouse as we know it today. Anybody here have a greenhouse of any kind of sort? One, two, okay, I have one. It's a Target bin that I turn upside down. That's my greenhouse. That's how I put my cuttings in there and I get them to root, and I've got seeds growing in these bins, okay? Greenhouse. Where did the greenhouse come from? We can thank a Roman emperor for the greenhouse. There he is right there. That's Tiberius. I always like to show a picture of a person because we tend to connect more with that person if we see a photograph. They wouldn't have cameras back in ancient Rome, but they did have sculptors, okay? The specularium is the prototype to what we now know as the greenhouse, all right? The Roman Emperor Tiberius was sickly. And if you're the Roman emperor, guess what you do? You tell your advisors, figure out a way to make me better. And so they traveled all over their conquered land and they found a cucumber, all right? He was the second emperor. He ruled from 14 to 37 CE. And they found an Armenian cucumber that they said, Tiberius, if you eat this every day, you'll be better. Okay? Could not find any reference as to whether he lived longer or died from whatever bad health he had, but he ate one of these every day. But it wasn't hardy in Rome. So you know what he told them? Figure out how to grow it here, because he didn't want them going all the way to Armenia to get the cucumbers and bring them. He said, figure out how to do this. So they were like, if we don't do this, we're going to be beheaded. It's quite the motivation, don't you think? Yep. And so what they ended up doing was they dug a big hole. I'll show you. They dug a big hole in the ground, and they covered it with what I used to play with as a kid, that mineral called mica that you can look through. Dig big hole. They put the plants down in there, the cucumbers down in there, and they put that mica over the top. And that protected the ground, insulated, and then the mica was translucent. That's the beginning of what we now know as the greenhouse. That's the end of chapter 1. And archaeologists have found places where they actually think that those were man-made specularium. Okay, we jump quickly to medieval gardening. Okay, we're talking about monasteries and manors, 476 to 1500 CE. Hortulanus was a monastery office containing ancient horticultural writings. Okay, and so they were all about herbs, spices, medicinal plants, and flowers. By the way, do you know that the medicinal plant is really, the medical world is really responsible for horticulture as we know it today. The first botanical garden in the world was associated with the university's pharmacy and medical department. All right, so most of the plant explorers in the late 17 and early 1800s were actually doctors. So they became the botanists. The health professionals became the botanists. I think that's fascinating. Anyway, well, in this monastery, the hortus conclusus was the enclosed garden. That was where they had all their collections, all right? They had a kitchen garden, an infirmary garden. You know what kind of plants were in the infirmary garden. They had a contemplation garden. All right, they're already thinking about mental health. Today we have research that's been done within the past 20 years to show the world how important gardening is to good mental, physical, psychological health, okay? Yet we gardeners, we knew it all along. But now we have actual research that's been done to show, all right, that if you have your kids study in a little outdoor garden, they're going to remember 20% more than if they're not studying in that same environment. If you put plants in a learning environment, you'll remember more than if they're not here. Look around. This is exactly what my classroom looks like at NC State. Okay? So what do I do to improve learning? I bring a plant with me every day to class and sit it down on the table. Now, they think it's funny, but I think it's working. All right? Oh, look, a pleasure garden, orchards, vineyards for the wine, for the fruit. Okay? This was all within the context of the monastic life. Garden style in the Middle Ages, enclosed gardens with fences or hedges, okay? Trellises, walkways, and arbors for shade, raised beds to avoid waterlogged soils, grass containing wildflowers, medicinal plants, apple orchards for cider, ornamental gardens, parks for relaxation and sport. Would you, if you squint your eyes and saw this list, and it said at the top of the slide, garden style for the 21st century, we always think we're coming up with a new thing. No, it's just been renamed and repackaged. Age of exploration, 1500s. This is one of my favorite times to think about the idea that the world is flat. We're going to venture out. We're going to bring things back to royalty. Okay, no matter what you think about it, it's quite exciting. Exploration to the New World. Spain and Portugal led the charge, led to new horticultural stuff in Europe. Okay, many of the things that we associate with European, from a food perspective, actually came from where they discovered it in other places in the world. Okay, corn, tobacco, tomatoes, sweet potatoes, squash, none of these originate. They all originate in Central and Southern America. Okay. Potato. Did you know the potato is native to Peru? Yes. Thank you. Okay. And it came from, the potato came from Peru and went to Europe, and then from Europe to North America. What a weird trip. That's like trying to get to the West Coast, or you try to get somewhere and your first stop is in an airport that doesn't make any sense as far as where you're going, right? It's fascinating, all right? Chocolate and vanilla. Yes, and you all are thinking, okay, let's see that. Swiss chocolate. What's the other new chocolate everybody's all excited about? Dubai, right? Yeah. There's not one chocolate plant in Dubai. Hello. Okay. Central and South America, chocolate and vanilla come from. Led to the development of many different horticultural industries in other places. One of the greatest areas for chocolate production is the west coast of Africa. All right. I know it's hard to see, but I came across this, and this was quite fascinating. These are the native edible plants from these regions in the world. Now let's start right up here. Here's North America. Well, we're rich with native plants, with native edible plants. We got blueberries, pumpkins, strawberries, cranberries, grapes, and not the kind of grapes that you it's muscadines, and then sunflowers. That's it. So, okay, this is I thought about, maybe I shouldn't say this, maybe I should, but I'm just going to say it. Okay, because I'm all about the science, not about the social media is just as bad on horticulture as it is on everything else. Okay, so you've got people that are all about native plants. Not a bad thing, all about native plants, okay? And different degrees of all about native plants, okay? Grow nothing but native plants in your garden. And they're the same people who are saying, grow all your food. How can you do that? Gonna eat a lot of blueberries? All right.
What about pawpaws and persimmons?
They should be up there too, okay? I think from this map, Kavana, this is basically the more herbaceous native plants. All right, but check this out. When we've got things like tomato and potato came from the Andes, came from Peru. Tomato and potato, all right? Look at citrus. Citrus comes from Eastern Asia. Northern Europe. Did you know apple? the apple, as we know it, the native apple comes from Kazakhstan. That's where it comes from. Okay, so this is an incredible map because all of a sudden you realize, oh my goodness, things are, we have a lot of non-native plants we're growing in our vegetable gardens and in our fruit gardens. All right, so let's talk vanilla just for a second because it's a great story about a person and a plant. Vanilla planifolia is the name. 8 to 10 foot vine, native to where? Central Mexico. Brought to Spain by Herman Cortez in 1520. By the way, he brought chocolate along too. Boy, that guy must have been really popular. Look what I got, chocolate and vanilla. And you're a European king or queen and you've never tasted either one? Holy smokes. Okay, this orchid, it's an orchid, is terrestrial or epiphytic. That means its roots will grow on the ground or on something else. And the flowers are pollinated by what's called an orchid bee. And there's an asterisk there for a reason. Okay, so there's the plant. There's the viney plant there. There's the flower, kind of a creamy yellow. And there's the fruit of the orchid right there, fruit of the vanilla orchid. And when that fruit turns brown, the beans are harvested when fully ripe and black in color. They're dried and they're sorted. The seeds, like Breyer's ice cream seeds, okay, the seeds are flavorless, but there's this kind of red goo around the seeds that contain a substance called vanillin, and that's where the flavor is located, okay? That's where the flavor is located. So, it gets discovered, it gets brought this, they can't grow it anywhere. They can't get the flowers to produce fruit. Anywhere they take it. They took it from its native place and they brought it, it was homesick. For 300 years, they couldn't get this thing to fruit outside of Mexico. 300 years. In 1836, they discovered that there was this Mexican bee, Melipone, was the sole pollinator of the vanilla orchid. And guess where they live? Mexico. All right? So in 1841, there was this gentleman by the name of Edmund Albius, developed a reliable way to hand pollinate. This is an awesome story, okay? Where? Madagascar and Saint Suzanne. Today, 75% of all vanilla is produced on those two little islands off the east coast of Africa, okay? There's the bee that does the pollination, and here is the technique that Edmund Albius designed. I don't even know what the technique is, but it gets better. First of all, where are we? There's Saint Suzanne Reunion. That's the island. Okay, there's Madagascar. So that's where most of the vanilla is produced. Okay, here he is, Edmund Albius, a 12-year-old slave boy in 1841 invented the technique for pollinating vanilla orchids profitably. Without this technique, it's unlikely that vanilla would not nearly be as well known as it is today, and there he is. 12-year-old boy. Without him, no vanilla. At least not the same degree of vanilla than if we had just had to rely on growing it solely in its small native area in Mexico. Yes?
Is that the first instance we know of hand pollination?
No. There was other hand pollination. It's just nobody could figure out how to do it by hand. That was the biggest concern. Quick history on potato. All right, and there's a lot of text here, so that's why you want to get the PDF. Native region, Peru, cultivation began 8 to 10,000 years ago in that native area, okay? First Europeans to see the potato, 1537, brought to Europe in 1570, to Spain, and then to the UK in 1588. Started out as food for livestock and impoverished people. Nightshade family and that whole nightshade family have alkaloid chemicals that can be poisonous, and so they were a bit afraid of that. That's why they fed it to the animals first and then to the lowlife second, sadly. Okay, became food for the working class in Europe. In fact, you know, the UK kind of said, we don't need potatoes. Okay, and the Irish said, we'll take them. And they needed them, right? But sadly, as a result of that reliance totally on potatoes, monoculture, okay, when the plague came, the Irish folks really, Ireland suffered immensely, resulting in a lot of potatoes being brought, the good ones being brought to the colonies, 1719. The potato famine in Ireland from 1845 to 1852, the fungus that was killing potatoes was Phytophthora infestans. 2 million number of people who immigrated between 1845 and 1850. 8.2 million Irish population in 1841, 6.6 million Irish population in 1851 from the emigration as well as from the incredible deaths that occurred. Okay, the history of the tomato. Okay, remember tomato and potato are kinfolk. Okay, they're related. Native region, Peru, up in the Andes. Indigenous peoples cultivated this plant as early as 700 BCE. Spread to Central America and Mexico. Never made it to North America, though. Okay, first Europeans to see the tomato were the Spaniards in the early 1500s. They brought seeds to Spain and spread them out around Europe to Italy by the mid-1500s. Spread throughout Europe as one of the first ornamental plants. Tomatoes actually were ornamental before they were edible. All right, names that these tomatoes got were wolf peach, gold apple, love apple, poison apple. All right, considered poisonous, the upper class Europeans died after eating tomatoes, where the lower class Europeans did not die. So the upper class Europeans thought they were cursed by the tomato, and they refused to eat the tomato, because when they did, they died. It was brought to North America in the early 1700s by European colonists. Isn't it interesting? The potato and the tomato took the long route to get to North America, and they have become staple foods here. Now, what's interesting is, as I'm talking about this, I look at your faces, and you're all going, go back to the thing about the rich people dying and the poor people not. I don't understand that, okay? Okay, by the way, pizza was invented in 1880. I had to put that in there, okay? Promoted the tomato's popularity, it really did. Okay, so what's going on with the tomato? Okay, the wealthy Europeans ate the tomatoes. They ate all their food on actual plates made out of metal, where the poor people in Europe ate on their plates made of wood, okay? And the metal plates that they used had lead in them. Tomatoes high acid, so the acid would dissolve the lead in the pewter plates, and then people would consume them, and they died from lead poisoning. Isn't that wild? Okay. It's 11, and I know it's tradition to take a break. So, want one now or in 15 minutes? It's your choice. Take it now. Okay, take it now. Take 3 to 5 minutes, no more. Okay. I'm always thankful after the break that everybody came back. Moving right along. French formal gardening of the 1600s. Okay, so now picture this. This would make a great movie. Okay, picture this. Here are the players. You've got King Louis XIV. Now, we all learned about King Louis XIV. He was called the Sun King. Okay, he named himself. He believed that the world revolved around him. That's why he called himself the Sun King. Okay, he has a finance minister by the name of Nick Fouquet. We'll call him Nick. Nicholas Fouquet. All right, and then so then we have this guy. This is King Louis. Then we have this guy named André Le Nôtre. Okay, there's Nick Fouquet, the finance minister. Doesn't he look a little bit sinister? Just okay. He's not, but he looks it, right? Okay, and then this is André Le Nôtre, very bohemian kind of, right? He's a landscape designer. He's a king. He's a finance minister. Okay, so here's the deal. Nick Fouquet hires André Le Nôtre to landscape the back of his new built home. All right, there it is, Vaux-le-Vicomte. 1656 to 1661, he builds the home, and he says, okay, I want you to design and build my backyard landscape. Okay, there it is. André Le Nôtre. Okay, so I've been there. And this is a photograph I took many years ago with a real camera that has film, right? So I didn't know what I was taking, and we're on the tour inside the building, and the tour guide says, no photographs, right? So this is me walking through the tour. I looked at the window, I saw the backyard, I had my camera right here, and when I went to hit the button, I coughed, and I didn't get caught, but that's the backyard. Okay, now formal French gardening, we could spend the rest of today's time talking about. It's a vista, it's very architectural, not much color. There's landscape design there, but that's not what makes the story so good. So he does this, and then Nick Fouquet decides to have a garden party to welcome everybody, all the royalty, to come to his house see his home, see his garden, right? Oh, everyone's, oh, Nick, this is incredible. King Louis XIV comes. He's ticked. He's ticked because now Nick Fouquet has something he doesn't have. By the way, this is pre-Versailles, pre-palace. Okay, so what does he do? He arrests Nick Fouquet for embezzlement of funds, which, by the way, he didn't do, puts him in prison for the rest of his life. He hires André Lenotre, and he says, I want something bigger and better. I'm going to build a bigger and better house, and I want a bigger and better garden. And that led to King Louis XIV's Versailles backyard. The Grand Vista goes on for miles in 1662. It was a 40-year project that André Lenotre managed. Right? So this is the drone up above. That's the top of Palace of Versailles. That's the Grand Vista. Yeah. And that's one of my photographs one day when I was actually able to go and catch the Grand Vista. So, okay, here is Louis XIV's backyard. Right? But if you look over to the left, if you're standing on the back porch and you look down to the backyard, and you look to the left, you see a railing and then a drop-off. And if you go to that railing, okay, if you go to that railing and you look at the drop-off, look at what you see. You see all these plants. Now, they're all in containers. Now, I want you to think, you're Louis XIV, you send explorers out, they come back from all these faraway places. One of your explorers comes back, he puts the crate down, and there's a bunch of orange balls in the crate. And he goes, what are those? You say, they're called oranges. And you take it and you cut it open, and he eats it, and it tastes better than anything he's ever tasted before. And so he finishes the box in about a week. He calls the explorer back. He says, go get more. So the guy goes. He's gone for a year or two. He comes back. Now he brought 2 boxes. Okay, finishes those 2 boxes. And what does the king tell him now? Go get the tree. Right? Go get the tree. So they go and get the tree, and they bring it back. But the tree can't grow in Paris, right, in Versailles. And so they had to figure out a way to grow these trees in containers and then put them somewhere in the wintertime where they wouldn't get hurt. Remember, this is chapter 2 in The Birth of a Greenhouse. And so what they ended up inventing and building was this thing called an orangerie. An orangerie. So what's an orangerie? Well, the orangerie, which I could take a photo of, by the way, if you tour this, they never let you get down there, down and dirty. But it is a big horseshoe-shaped structure that's built into the ground with these large windows, all right? It was built in 1684, 1686, 500 feet long, 42 feet deep, but it's horseshoe, 500 feet total. The winter temperature in there, not heated, the winter temperature in there is 45 degrees. It stays constant by the insulation from the ground, no matter how cold it gets outside. Okay, these are all citrus. These are all citrus. And so they'll tolerate freezing and slightly below freezing for about 3 or 4 hours before they're damaged. And so an orangerie is an overwintering structure where you put the plants in there, not to grow them, but just to hold them for the winter. And then when it gets warmer, they come back out.
Are they outside or are they inside the building?
These plants, they're outside, and then when winter comes, these big windows open up like doors, and everything goes in and is held in there. It's not a greenhouse. It's an orangerie. It's an overwintering structure. Okay, 2nd chapter in The Birth of a Greenhouse, overwintering structure. And then, can you imagine the science that was developed in how to go about growing plants in containers, right, in the 1600s? Right, and trees nonetheless. So there's a good shot. You can see how it goes. And of course, there I am right there on the railing. I don't know. Okay, but every time I went, I've been to Versailles 3 times, and I can't get permission to go down amongst now they use forklifts. They pick the tree up and they drive it into I'd like to have seen how they got them all in and out. I'm just a yeoman's effort just to have some citrus. Okay, and then what happened is that caught on where freestanding buildings were built and designed to overwinter similar types of subtropical plants. Okay, and then we have this dude in the 1700s, a guy by the name of Linnaeus. Carl Linné was his name. He was born in 1707, died in 1778. He was in Uppsala. That's where he grew up. And as an 8-year-old, the people in the village called him the little botanist. Oh, here comes the little botanist. Because he was always out in the woods gathering plants, and he was always talking to people about them. Look at this, and this is different than this. Can you imagine how kind of frustrating. It might have been for some of the townspeople. It's like, oh, here comes the little botanist again. He's going to, here you go. You know, what's he going to amount to? Okay. What did he major in when he went to college? His father was a preacher. Okay. But he majored in medicine and got his doctorate, right? He became a doctor of medicine in 1741 and then decided in 1742 he wanted to teach botany at Uppsala University. So he changed departments. Okay. There's that medical connection with botany. Okay. And then he decided, good old Linnaeus, he decided that there wasn't a really good way to name plants no one had a good way to name them and not create lots of confusion. Because if you're in Sweden, you had certain names for plants, but the minute you cross the border, the plants had different names. He said, wouldn't it be great if we had names that would be universal, that everyone in the world that loves plants would use? We'd eliminate all this confusion, right? By the way, if you don't even know much about him, you got to think, well, if they put him on money and stamps, you know you've made it, right? Right? So here I am with Linnaeus. This is a bronze statue of Carl von Linné at the Chicago Botanic Garden. I was tickled. I've been teaching plant nomenclature for years, right? And so here I am with the father of plant nomenclature. There's the placard there. Carl Linnaeus was regarded as the father of taxonomic botany. Swedish botanist, best known for creating a system to classify plants based on the number of reproductive parts. His system brought order to the scientific plant world. Linnaeus also helped establish a universal system for naming organisms known as the binomial nomenclature, where you have a genus, a specific epithet, and the two make up the species. That's where it comes from. He came up with that idea. And to prove how well it would work, in 1753, he published this book where he introduced 6,000 plants with brand new names, right? And said, we should all be using these. Let's come home. One of the fathers of American horticulture by the name of John Bartram, 1699 to 1677. He was American born, so he was born as a colonist, okay? English roots, 1699 to 1677. He was a farmer. He farmed in Philadelphia. He was self-taught. Guess who he learned? Linnaeus, right? So he used the binomial system when he went and collected plants, because that's what he did. He collected plants. He was buddies with Ben Franklin and the like, okay? He was the first American-born plant collector, the first American-born plant collector. In other words, there were Europeans who would come and collect plants, but he was the first one who was born here, and then he would leave his farm and go on these junkets collecting plants, all right? This is really important. First Linnaean botanist in the colonies, all right? So he used the binomial system. He'd go up into New England, Lake Ontario, all the way down to Florida. He had a buddy, a Quaker buddy in England by the name of Peter Collinson, all right? You see him? That's Peter Collinson. Okay, they were pen pals. And here's the arrangement they came up with, because he was a farmer. He couldn't really afford to take these trips out in the woods, collect plants and bring them back. And so what he would do, he and Collinson came up with an agreement. Here was the agreement. Peter was a big horticultural to-do in England, and he rubbed shoulders with the king, all right, a king of England at the time. And Peter said, hey, I'll tell you what, John, you send me your discoveries and let me introduce them to England and take credit for their introduction, and I'll send you a stipend where you can go and collect more plants. All right? And you know what John said? You got a deal. John cared more about the plants and the ones he could find and being able to do all this than he cared about getting recognition for his work. Now, I ask 18 to 24-year-olds, and I even ask myself, how many of us would be willing to give up credit for our good hard work in order to continue to do the things that we love? That's a hard one to answer. I mean, it's real easy to go, yep, I would. What if you were faced with that? I thought, this is really amazing that he did this. And you think, and here's the message I have for young people. Do this. Don't worry about the accolades. Don't worry about the awards, okay? Because if you do this, they're going to happen. Because here's what happened. The king, can you imagine this? King goes to Collinson, dude, these are great plants and they're coming from my colonies. That's awesome. Hey, have you ever been? Peter goes, nope, not me. He goes, well, where are you getting them from? Oh, my buddy John Bartram sends them to me. Really? What's his name again? John Bartram. He goes, okay. He says, I'm getting rid of the middleman. The king appoints John Bartram as the king's botanist and funds the rest of his collection life. And all he cared about doing was doing what he loved doing, even to the point where he gave away the credit for having discovered those plants. I think that's really cool. So in 1765, King George III makes him the king's botanist. Bartram's box, 100 different seed varieties, dried samples, plants, etc. This is, come on, there we go. This is what a Bartram's box would look like. This would go over on the ships to Peter, right? And then to the king, right? So there were these things called the Bartram's box. This is kind of a museum version of what might have all been this. By the way, John Bartram wasn't just a plant geek. He was a naturalist. He was interested in all the wildlife that came along with the plants. Isn't that fascinating? We are entering into a time in the 21st century as gardeners, is the actual importance of biodiversity across all species, plants, and animals becomes incredibly important for us as gardeners to help maintain, because of the fact that we have destroyed so many habitats for these ecosystems to work in balance. We have the power to do that even on some library property. Right, Flora? Right. Okay. So guess what? He had kids. John was married, had kids. One of his sons, William Bartram, there he is. There's William. There's John on the right. Here's William. See some resemblance? Okay. William turns out traveling with his dad. Toward the end of his dad's life, he travels with him, right? And William, oh my gosh, William writes a book that reads like a novel. Oh my gosh, called Travels and Other Writings. There it is, Travels and Other Writings. So this, thank you. This is a map of all the different places that William Bartram goes, son of John's son, fifth of 9 kids, had a twin sister. He traveled with his dad in 1765-66. Naturalist, artist, author, travels 1773, 1776. Guys, honestly, it reads better than a lot of novels do. And it was first published in 1791, right? So cool, all right? And he also was an illustrator, a botanical illustrator. That's William Bartram, okay? You know, I thought I might have done okay in my career. William Bartram writes a book, illustrator, naturalist, unbelievable. But it turns out that apparently John and William had some estrangement going on. John was not really happy with William, but I can't find anywhere in the history books that talk about what their beef was. But I have a theory. You want to hear my theory? Yes. Very simply this. William hung out with, okay, all the revolutionaries who were trying to stir up the pot when it came to American Revolution, okay? John was the king's botanist. Hello? I got a feeling it's like, William, did you go hang out with those guys down at the tavern again that are talking about a revolution? Yes, Dad. I told you not to do that. You're going to get yourself in trouble. You'll probably get yourself killed, right? Because John Bartram died within eyesight of the British who were fighting the colonists. Yeah. This is Macanopy, Florida. I was there one time. My wife and I had to go to Florida State University to Gainesville, and there's a little town, Macanopy, that's noted for its antique furniture. And so we're walking the streets of Macanopy, okay, cute little town in Florida. And I come across this sign, Macanopy, Florida. The Timucua Indian village of the Patano tribe was located near here when the early Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto led this expedition through the area in 1539. Botanist William Bartram, I peed my pants right there. I'm in the middle of this little town. I said to my wife, get over here. The first permanent white settlement, visited Cuscahuila village in 1774, the first permanent white settlement in what is now Alachua County called Wanton was started in 1821. So I was like, oh, so I got to tell you the story about William Bartram, because my wife doesn't hear all my stories. And she's like, I'm really looking for a dresser. I don't need to be talking about William Bartram. So we're walking down the street a little bit further, and there's another sign, William Bartram. Now I'm really excited. There he is, the great Quaker naturalist of Philadelphia, made a long journey through the southeastern states in the 1770s, collecting botanical specimens. In May 1774, he visited Seminole Chief Cowkeeper at the Indian village of Cuscawilla, located near this spot. His book, Travels, and then I said to my wife, I have that book. She was not impressed. Provided the earlier reliable account of North Florida landscape, flora, fauna, and Indian life, and his vivid images of local scenes inspired these people, Coleridge, Wordsworth, and Emerson. So don't ever let anybody tell you that botanists and horticulturists aren't cultured and can't cross over in different areas. Guys, all this stuff is all interwoven, okay? You know you've made it when? They do stamps. Stamps and postcards. There's the Bartram father and son, okay? I'd be remiss if we didn't at least talk about John Chapman, Johnny Appleseed, because he did exist, all right? John Chapman, 1774, 1845, started out in Massachusetts, traveled through Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Illinois, started apple nurseries and sold trees. First of all, he collected seeds from the cider houses that were growing apples to make cider, which is what we would call wine and beer today. It didn't taste like wine and beer, it was cider. That was the drink of choice back in those days, okay? Back in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And so he would collect the seeds, he would go to these different places, and he'd start nurseries. He would start nurseries because people were settling in those states. And if you settled in a state and you built a house, you would build your own orchard, not for mom's apple pie. You'd build it to collect the apples. You didn't care what kind of apples they were, because apples don't come true from seed. You collect the apples, you'd press them, you'd make cider, and you'd have your own cider. That's how apples got distributed across. Now, in your orchard, you might have found one where the apples got a little bit bigger, maybe nice color. You picked it off and you took a bite out of it and went, wow, this one you could eat all by yourself. All right, that was the beginning of the cultivars of apples that we now grow, okay? But this guy was a businessman, okay? Yeah, but was he barefoot? Yes. Did he have a pot on his house head? Yes, okay? He had 1,200 acres of nurseries in three different states. He distributed seeds and cultural information on how to build a nursery for cider, okay? He was also a missionary. He adhered to something called the Swedenborgian gospel, which basically, the very simple is that God reveals himself to people through nature. And that's why he slept outside and was barefoot. Cider, 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 Applejack. That was his motivation. By the way, today, Johnny Appleseed would be rubbing shoulders with Elon Musk. I don't mean he'd like him. I'm saying, no, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that he'd be that wealthy. That's how wealthy he was in those days' dollars compared to today. Okay? He was this shrewd businessman. Okay? It wasn't like, oh, I'm going to make apples for America. No, that was not. That's the way I got taught him as a kindergartner. Johnny Appleseed, no, Johnny Appleseed was trying to make cash. 1,200 acres upon his death. Oh, look, they even have a gravestone in Fort Wayne, Indiana that commemorates where he was buried. Johnny Appleseed.
They're still teaching about him in school.
They are. Yes, they are. Yep. See, a real person. He almost sounds mythical, but it was nothing more than a good business venture that obviously he loved apples. He might have loved cider just as much. Chapter 3 in The Birth of a Greenhouse, the Great Crystal Palaces. This is chapter 3. Okay? In 1816, something happened that completely and totally changed horticulture. Two things. One, central heating was invented. In other words, a building like this, up until 1816, had to be heated from within. Now, they figured out a way to create something to burn fuel outside and then pump hot water into the building to heat it. Sound familiar? Anybody here still have a radiator? Okay. That was 1816, central heating was developed, okay? So that was the first thing that led to being able to create an orangery that you could put freestanding outside and keep it warm enough to keep plants in, even to the point where horticulturists were like, not only can we just keep them warm enough to live, we can actually grow them in there. We can provide an environment where we control all the environmental features. Second thing that happened was the invention of plate glass in the 1830s. Plate glass. So now you can make big glass panels. And that led to the advent of the Victorian Crystal Palace during Queen Victoria's time. So here we are, Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh, Scotland, and this was the palm house that was built in 1857, right in the time of these great crystal palaces. There it is. And that's my own picture. I took it with film many, many years ago, and I was on a garden tour. I was on a tour of England and Scotland that included visiting gardens, but this particular day, the people on the bus all wanted to go downtown and shop Princess Street. I never went. Okay, because the driver said he would go to the Edinburgh Botanic Gardens for anybody who wanted to go. So there were 3 of us who went to the Botanical Garden. So here I am walking through the Botanical Garden in Edinburgh, and I see the Palm House, and it's noon, 5 after noon. And so I go into the Palm House, and all the workers, all the people that work in there were gone because they were having lunch. And I'm walking through, and I had the shock of my life. See the wheelbarrow that came from China? You see the little rubber suit? Okay. I thought somebody was falling over. So I went running over. It's like, no, don't jump. And that was the 2-story Great Crystal Palace. And to that end, about the Crystal Palaces, I've got to back you up a little bit. Chatsworth Estate in Devonshire, England. First Duke of Devonshire, member of the Cavendish family in the 1600s, builds this. Hey, does this look familiar to any of you?
Yes.
Maybe seen it in a movie? What movie? How about Pride and Prejudice? Pride and Prejudice?
Pride and Prejudice.
Yeah, Pride and Prejudice was, this is where Mr. Darby sat on the right?
Darcy?
Mr. Darcy, not Darby. Thank you. Listen, I had two daughters. I've seen Pride and Prejudice about 19 times, and I still can't get Mr. Darcy's name right, okay? Anyway, so this is that estate. It's now part of the National Trust properties in England, which is maintained by the government, but the gardens have been maintained as well, all right? So there's the first Duke, and there's the fountain, there, Mr. Darcy, and what was her name? Can't remember her name. Okay. Oh, there she is. There's Keira Knightley, right? And then they have, this is a cascade. It was built in 1696 by Monsieur Grillet, a French hydraulics designer. There's a pond a mile up in the hills that runs water down to the cascade, down to the bottom, and then recirculates it back up again. 1696, that's the cascade. I'm standing in the middle of the cascade 5 minutes after they turned it on, and so the water's coming toward me. So I'm going to get a picture, and then I run out. That's their orangerie, but now it's a library, or not a library, it's a bookstore. Okay? The 6th Duke of Devonshire, the head of the Chatsworth estate, he had a major interest in horticulture. He hires his friend, this guy by the name of Joseph Paxton, who is a horticulturist. He hires Joseph Paxton. I'll show you a picture of him in a second. The 6th Duke was elected the president of the Royal Hort Society in 1838. He established the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. Has anybody ever heard of Kew Gardens? Okay, we can thank the 6th Duke of Devonshire for that establishment, and we can thank the king, okay? We can thank the king, who was also a plant geek at the time, okay? Cavendish receives bananas in 1834, and Paxton, his buddy that he hires to run Chatsworth, is able to cultivate the bananas in the greenhouses that he designed and built. And so notice that the binomial system, see how these things come together? The binomial system gives the bananas the name Musa Cavendishii. Sir Joseph Paxton, 1803 to 1865, head gardener at Chatsworth starting in 1826. Okay, so that makes him 23 years old. I'm just putting age perspective on this. The 6th Duke of Devonshire hires him, okay, in 1825. He's knighted before his death in 1865. Knighted, the Queen knighted him. Queen Victoria knighted this guy. He's in the same group with Paul McCartney. That too. The Great Conservatory took him 4 years to build it in 1840. Okay? It was 34,000 square feet, this conservatory. All 3 of these guys are Joseph Paxton. I love the mutton chops. Aren't they cool? All right. And this was on a placard just outside the Great Conservatory. It's his journal. He says, I left London by the Comet coach for Chesterfield, arrived in Chatsworth at about 4:30 in the morning of the 9th of May, 1826. As no person has been seen at that early hour, I got over the greenhouse gate by the old covered way, explored the pleasure grounds, and looked around the outside of the house. I then went down to the kitchen garden, scaled the outside wall, and saw the whole of the place. Set the men to work there at 6 o'clock, then returned to Chatsworth and got Thomas Weldon to play me the waterworks, and afterwards went to breakfast with poor dear Mrs. Gregory and her niece Sarah Brown. The latter fell in love with me and I with her, and thus completed my first morning's work at Chatsworth before 9 o'clock. Why does every horticulturist of old times have to be a poet? I just love that, all right? First day on the job, not only got everybody working, but found his wife. And there's an actual photograph of the Great Conservatory. The largest conservatory in the world at the time that it was built. And there are some of the men sitting on the sides of it. Can you imagine just the size of the foundation of that conservatory? He made the front door big enough so that Queen Victoria's carriage could get in. I think that's why she knighted him, because he accommodated her. She said, I've never seen anything like this. He was commissioned to build the even bigger conservatory for the, do you remember the London, had the big, it was like a big World Expo, the London Expo in 1851. He built that one, and that one burnt down by fire. Okay. 9th Duke of Devonshire. Okay, so by the time the 9th Duke came along, okay, it was right around end of World War I, and the British economy was in the tank, right? And they were having a hard time paying for the heating and the water and all this for the plant. So the 9th Duke blew this up. He blew up the largest conservatory in the world, blew it up. So it no longer is there today. No. Okay, but that's what it looked like. Oh, by the way, the reason why this lily is called Victoria, okay, is because even though it was collected from South America, he was the first one to be able to grow it in captivity, and he named it after his queen. There's the foundation. Do you all see the foundation? That's just one end of the foundation. So unbeknownst to me, back in 1983, this is a 1983 photograph, okay? I'm this young faculty member. I'm on this trip with a group of garden enthusiasts. We're on a bus. I'm supposedly the expert. What I'm supposed to be the expert about is what is that plant? We'd be driving down the bus 65 miles an hour, and someone would go, Bryce, what's that tree? And I'd go, ah. So I just started naming trees. They would never know. So I'm in this garden at Chatsworth Estate. I know nothing about what I just told you. Nothing. I don't know about Joseph Paxton. I don't even know that that's the foundation of the Great Conservatory, right? And so I'm all excited because these lupins are all in full bloom. I'm like, oh, I got to take a picture. So I run over here to the corner of the foundation and climb up to take a photograph. Okay, there's my wife. My wife looks at me and she says, get down. You don't need to be up there. Right? And at that very moment, there's a man right over here. You see him way over on the left, that's his backside. He's weeding a bed of peonies, right? He stands up and goes, no! My wife goes, see? So I'm like, I'm sorry. He goes, no. I said, I'm sorry. He said, no, that's not the best photograph. I said, excuse me? He says, no, the best photograph comes from being up on that wall, and then you'll get the whole thing, and that's why I took that picture. So I got to talking to this man, this gardener at Chatsworth, 86 years old, been a gardener since he was 16. Now here's this young faculty member. I'm 25 years old, and I've been taught by our society that true success comes as you jump up the ladder and you climb the ladder higher and higher as you go. And now I'm talking with an 86-year-old man who has been a gardener in this same place for 70 years. Changed my whole perspective. Y'all, I started at NC State, I finished there, or I'm still finishing there, I guess. But no, seriously, it's like, oh, there is a certain degree of contentment that comes from doing something that you love. And then he apologized and said, I'm so sorry that the lupins are 1 week gone by. I'm like, yeah, you better apologize. Because then he did let me get up on that corner, and I did get a picture. And then I went home to Raleigh, North Carolina, and tried to grow these. Wasn't my fault. Anyway, isn't that an awesome story? Okay. And there's that awesome foundation that held up that beautiful, beautiful structure. Wow. And there's where I took the picture, up from the top, up on the wall up there. And that led to the classic 1960s version of what we now call the greenhouse, a controlled atmospheric structure that allows us to grow things like poinsettias, which are native in Central America that would only be able to be grown here if we had greenhouses and we were able to influence that, environment. How many are familiar with the rural cemetery movement? No, I wasn't either. Okay, who knew? But before 1831, people got buried downtown, right? Or at the church in a plot, you know. So here's what was happening. Boston was filling up with so many people and so many buildings that there was no place to bury their dead. And so this guy by the name of Henry Dearborn and Jacob Bigelow and Alexander Wadsworth, some were retired military, others they were all members of the Massachusetts Horticultural Society, existed in the early 1830s. Okay, think about societies, garden clubs. Carter, we were talking about garden clubs, and they all these organizations all started late 1800s, early 1900s, and they bought 70 acres out in the country. Out in the country, and they said, hey, here's an idea. Let's create a pastoral setting, botanical garden, arboretum, where we bury our dead. That was a new idea in 1831. And that began the public parks and gardens movement and began what's called the rural cemetery movement. So you can go to places like Spring Grove Cemetery in Cincinnati, Ohio, happened less than 20 years after a Mount Auburn Cemetery. Guess where Mount Auburn Cemetery is located? Cambridge, Massachusetts, way out in the country. No, you're driving down the road going, I'm looking for this thing. I read the history, right? No, I mean, it's Cambridge. If you've ever been to Cambridge, Massachusetts, you're in Boston. That's urban sprawl. Mount Auburn Cemetery, 174 acres, 100,000 people buried there, 5,500 trees, 700 different species and varieties and cultivars of plants, thousands of shrubs and herbaceous perennials, 220 species of birds, 10 miles of roads and paths. If you're ever in that area and someone says, where would you like to go? We got a free day in Boston. Say, I'd like to go to the Mount Auburn Cemetery. It is absolutely a magical place where we have ornamental plants mixed with headstones, and every road sign, every path is named after a plant. There's Beach Avenue. Just a lovely, lovely setting. It's one of my favorite places to go. And still, even in Mount Auburn Cemetery, people are still carving their names into the beech trees. But I love the fact that all the paths and roads have names. And here's my wife and I standing under Daphne Path. Now, why would we have our photograph taken under a road sign that says Daphne Path on it?
That's her name.
Whose name?
Your wife's name.
No, my wife's name is Sue. Yeah. I appreciate you taking the bait, though. Okay. No, it's because of this young lady here. That's my granddaughter, Daphne Joy. There she is. First grandkid and only grandkid to be named after a plant, right? I'll never forget when we walked in, we've got a little girl, and they hadn't told us the name before it was born. So I looked at my daughter, Megan, and I said, Megan, what's her name? I'm holding her. What's her name? And she said, Dad, before I tell you her name, Dr. Bass, that was her doctor, okay, who delivered the baby. He wants to know what would be a good small flowering tree to go up his driveway, right? She's holding me hostage. I said, Japanese fringe tree, Kainanthus retusus. Okay, now what's her name? She said, Daphne. I almost dropped the baby. I said, oh my gosh, named her after a plant. And so I sent this photograph here to Daphne and said, look, I found you up in Mount Auburn Cemetery. Okay, I told you I wasn't going to have enough time to go through the entire history, but that's okay. But if we don't talk about this guy, we can finish with this guy and then we'll have questions. Okay, does that seem fair? Everybody good? Okay. Liberty Hyde Bailey, L.H. Bailey for short. Was born in 1858, died in 1954. Okay, y'all, I don't mean to exaggerate. I don't believe I'm exaggerating. But I would say that if it weren't for L.H. Bailey, the state of horticulture in the United States would not even closely look like it looks like today. I'm not just talking about gardening, not just gardening, but professional horticulture. Okay, he made a huge mark. I mean, if you say Steve Jobs when it comes to phones than this guy when it comes to horticulture, L.H. Bailey. See if I can convince you. First of all, he grew up on a Michigan farm. His dad was a master grafter and grew apples. That was what his dad did. He was a farmer, and he had an orchard. So there was his connection, all right? Before I tell you where he went to college, as a kid, he got scarlet fever, and his brothers ended up not. And so his brothers ended up working with his dad on the farm, and LH, in his recovery, couldn't work, so he spent the days roaming the forest. So he became much more connected to nature at that time, to the degree where he ultimately attended Michigan Agricultural College in 1878 to 1882. Does anybody know what that college is called today? Michigan State University. So Michigan Agricultural College was one of the first land grant institutions, just like NC State University. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm in Durham, but I'm going to say NC State's like the best. Okay. He worked with this dude named Asia Gray as an assistant during an internship for the summer. He did it twice for 2 years. Asia Gray wrote Gray's Anatomy, not the show, but the book, okay? Plant anatomy, okay? So Asia Gray was this incredibly renowned botanist of his time. So you can see Liberty Hyde Bailey was just sucking in all this information, okay? He ultimately, when he graduated, got hired to teach at Michigan Agricultural College in 1885 and became a master teacher there. Everybody wanted to take L.H. Bailey's classes. And he taught fruit production, vegetable production, he taught landscape design. He was this incredible teacher. He's married. Okay, back when you had to go to college, or when you went to college, you got accepted, but then you had to take an entrance exam. And so all the prospective freshmen of his class, in a big giant horseshoe, there are about 35 of them, all in a big horseshoe, and they're all sitting, and there's one female and all the rest male. L.H. Bailey's over here, the female is across from him. So they start doing the eye flirtation, kind of, right? And back then, everybody had a stopwatch, okay? Today, everybody be, with their phone. If you were trying to flirt with somebody and you didn't want to make eye contact for too long, you'd probably be going like this, and you go like this. And then they look at you and you look back down, right? Well, that's what he and this girl got to doing with their pocket watches. He'd pull his out and he looked at her, and when she looked at him, he'd look down at his pocket watch, and then he'd look over at her. She'd look down at her pocket watch. That flirtation led to dating and marriage. So he married her. I think that's just a cool story. And they had 2 daughters. L.H. Bailey penned the 25-25-25-year plan. Here was his plan for life. You spend the first 25 years of your life getting educated. Second 25, you work. And the third 25, you do what you want to do. Notice he didn't say retire. He said you just do what you want to do, right? And what's interesting is, after 25 years, he taught for 25 years, and then he retired and did what he wanted to do for 25 years. What was that? He traveled all over the world and wrote books, numerous books on different groupings of plants. That's what he did. He lived it out. He actually coined the term cultivar. You all familiar with cultivar, cultivated variety? That came from L.H. Bailey. Okay, there he is as a young man. And there he is as a college professor. Do you know who, if they should do a movie on L.H. Bailey, and sadly, the person that I would have cast has passed away. Great actor, great comedian, right? Robin Williams. Doesn't that look like Robin Williams? Yeah. I have thought about dressing up as L.H. Bailey and coming into my class and talking to them as if I was L.H. Bailey, but I don't think I could pull it off, so I don't do it. I talk about him more so than anything else. There he is with his wife and 2 daughters. He gets a professorship at Cornell University in 1888. He writes a book, Cyclopedia of Horticulture, in 1900, amongst other books. He's the founder of the American Society for Horticultural Science. That's our professional association, like the American Medical Association. That's our horticultural version of it. In 1903, he founded that. He founded the College of Agriculture, the first college of agriculture in any university at Cornell in 1904. First one. And then they made him dean. So he was the dean of the college. In 1908, President Teddy Roosevelt made him the chair of the rural parks study, or rural living study. Basically, he said, I want you to get a bunch of good, big thinkers together and start talking about how we can help rural places get information from these universities to those rural places. He was the chair of that committee. And you know what that bore? How many of you are Master Gardener Extension Master Gardener volunteers? Without him, you're not here, okay? That created the Smith-Lever Act, i.e. the Extension Service was born out of that commission. So he was buddies with Teddy Roosevelt, okay? The Commission on Country Life, that's what it was called. And that led to the extension, the federal bill, Smith-Lever Act of 1914. Thank you, L.H. Bailey. He was the dean until 1913 when he retired. So guys, when I started studying L.H. Bailey, I decided that I wanted to do the 25-25-25-year plan, right? And so I was 23 when I finished my education. I was 56 when I retired, stopped working, and then since then, by the way, L.H. Bailey died at 96, so he blew his 25-25-year plan out of the water, and that's why I adopted it, okay? So now I just do what I want to do. Yeah, Bryce, but you're still teaching. Yep, but that's what I want to do, right? And that type of thing. So, there. This is L.H. Bailey standing next to all the books that he wrote. Yeah, he wrote 65 books, 1,300 journal articles, 100 papers in pure taxonomy, countless popular papers and newspaper articles. Herbarium donated in 1935 is a collection of plant samples that contain 140 specimens. He had a table, a desk, where he had all his different projects. And he'd start working on a project, and if he hit a mental block, he'd put it down and he'd grab another one. That's how he was so productive. And most of those books were written after he retired. He was very much spent a lot of time in the New York State Legislature building, testifying and promoting agriculture. I have this book. This book is required in the introductory horticulture class at Michigan State University, interesting enough. L.H. Bailey, An Informal Biography. And so I've read this book, and it's actually quite remarkable. There's LH in the herbarium, and a herbarium is nothing but a place where you collect samples, you dry them, and then you keep them as a library. And boy, I'll tell you what, in this digital age, I hope that never goes away. There he is. There's Teddy Roosevelt, okay? I want to read something can I read something from this book? It'd be a good way to end. And then we can do some questions. So where I pick up is where L.H. Bailey is now this young horticulture professor at Michigan State, Michigan Agricultural College. And he got paid a reasonable salary, nothing great. And but as a professor, he needed transportation, right? Late 1800s. Needing a rig, Bailey bought a horse and buggy. The buggy didn't seem properly balanced on its springs. A friend suggested that there was this young guy in Lansing with a shop down by the river who could fix buggies or watches or anything that needed tinkering. So Bailey drove down to the shop, left his buggy with the lanky proprietor, a young man in his middle 20s, and when he returned, the buggy had been fixed. He thanked the man, paid him, and then dismissed the matter from his mind, just like you and I would do if we brought our car in to be fixed. Years later, when the name of the mechanic became a household word, L.H. Bailey was able to tell people how young Henry Ford had once fixed his wagon. Isn't that something? What an amazing era in our country's history when you think the late 1800s and all that was going on. When you think about air travel, you think about the automobile, and then you think about there were other people who were doing just as amazing things in their field as these others were. But because it's horticulture, maybe not a lot of people hear or read about L.H. Bailey, but was every bit as influential. Started the Extension Service. I've got another book on his biography where he talks about, he was at L.H. Bailey would come and speak in a room this big with this many people, constantly. He never said no. And many times in his book, he says, listen, before you let any water out of the hose on your garden, take advantage of as much water that comes from the skies as you can. He was always already talking about water-wise gardening before it was ever a problem in central North Carolina during the 2007-8 drought, okay? So, and if we go back and we look throughout the course of history, and I have other stories of people that come along, it's like the way we sit in the way that we garden has been immensely influenced by the observation, the wisdom, and the experience of these people and these peoples and these places of all these years. And so hopefully you learned something you didn't know, you're inspired in some way, shape, or form, and maybe you'll garden just a little bit differently as a result. Questions? Comments? That means I did my job. Yes?
When Lanai came up with his system, how did he convince everybody to follow it?
Oh, that's an awesome question. When Carl von Linné came up with a system, how did he convince everybody, right? How did he end up convincing everybody that it was work? The answer is he didn't. He didn't convince everybody. There were others who had come up with somewhat similar systems that argued that they got it first and he didn't, or that he stole it. I mean, what is different about humanity, even in horticulture? We're going to try to take credit for things we didn't do and vice versa. So the publication that he wrote was the basis for that slow but sure change across the land, okay? But it was, cultural change takes time. Don't we know that on all fronts? Cultural change takes a lot of time, and it takes a commitment. I suspect that, that Linnaeus was everywhere. Think about it. Who would have ever thought that John Bartram read Linnaeus? He's in the colonies. He's been born in Philadelphia, and somehow he was so interested, somebody got him that book, and he learned the binomial system that way. So now you have John Bartram, the North America's first American-born plant collector. Now he's communicating using the binomial system. So it's really kind of this organic system. Now, that all being said, go to your local garden center and look at the tags of plants. And we will see how incredibly lazy we human beings are when it comes to, here's a system that if it's used by everyone, eliminates confusion of common names, shows when plants are related to one another, okay? And the third is international. I was in Germany. I'm a young 20-something-year-old guy. My wife is a child of German immigrants. We went there because they wanted to see the first American to marry into their family. That was me. So now I'm there, right? And they're just looking at me like this, and I'm like this. I can't speak German. They can't speak English, right? They throw me in a car. They don't even tell me where I'm going. They leave my wife behind, my translator. They bring me to this. They stop. They get me out of the car. They drive away. I'm in the middle of Germany. I can't read the German language. I can't speak. I'm in the middle, right? Where am I? I see this something botanisch. They drop me off at a botanical garden. So I walk inside. Now I'm looking around. First plant I see says Acer rubrum. Oh my gosh, I felt so good because I knew what that was. Germans say Acer rubrum, Japanese say Acer rubrum. Anybody that embraces the binomial system, that's the plant's name, right? So I walk around the corner and there's this worker on his knees weeding, and he looks up at me and says, "Ah, wie geht's?" And I'm like, typical American, hello, right? So now I'm thinking, how can I communicate with this guy? And so I said, Calmia latifolia? He goes, oh yeah, Calmia latifolia. He grabs me, stands up, he grabs me, walks up to this plant, he goes, Calmia latifolia. I said, yeah, Calmia latifolia. He says, das good? I said, das good. Okay, the whole day, the whole 3 hours, Fritz took me all over the potato. That's a true story. Okay, now I have students that look at me and go, well, how does that, why should I embrace the binomial system? I said, because someday you're going to be in another country, but moreover, someday you're going to be on an international website that is only using scientific names. And if you use, right, Sweet Betsy, you're stuck, right? So, yeah, yes.
This is a perfect segue for my question, which is, I I like work towards that besides just memorizing cards.
Yeah, it is so hard. How do you learn the scientific names? It's so hard. Raise your hand if you knew your name when you were born. That's a dumb question, isn't it? Of course I didn't know my name. So, and what is your name? Chelsea? So Chelsea, when you were born, your parents started calling you that. And repeatedly, right? One day you got to be maybe toddler age and the friends came over and they said, hey, watch this, right? Trying to show off their kid. Said, hey, Chelsea, what's your name? Right? Tell Mr. Jones what your name is. And you went, Chelsea. And everybody clapped. You got that positive reinforcement, okay? So now you had your name memorized, right? Raise your hand if you have your name memorized. Not one of you has your name memorized. Chelsea, even you don't, because basically after you had your name memorized, what did you do? You used it and you used it and you used it, and that memorized language became you. It became you, who you were. I don't have a secret for scientific names. For some people, it's real easy or a lot easier. For others, it's way more difficult, but it's kind of like get it, repeat it, use it. Try real hard to not use the common name because the common name is going to try to pull you. I mean, I took my first Plant ID class in 1976. When I walk up to a white oak now, Quercus alba fills my being. White oak doesn't even come into my head. Sometimes I know the scientific name, I can't remember the common name, right? Some of my students in Plant ID go, that's scary. You know, but it becomes learned language, not memorized language. But equals work, right? Yeah. Yes.
When did garden centers become a thing?
For me? Or for?
Not like in history.
Oh, in history? Well, first of all, the wealthy, ancient wealthy people had time on their hands and they had resource. And somehow there's this intuitive connection between human beings and nature where they wanted to create spaces that would make them feel better. So that's kind of like where did it begin? I mean, if you're asking me, I'll tell you the Garden of Eden is where it began, right? So, you know, this isn't about your beliefs. This is about, okay, think about that story, right? First place we ever were in a garden. There's this connection between human beings and a garden, okay? But resource. I mean, you think before the Industrial Revolution, you'd go to work before the sun would come up, you'd come home after the sun went down, and all you were doing is trying to feed your family and move forward. You had no time, no recreational time whatsoever. So the Industrial Revolution, at least in North America, really marks the beginning of gardening. Now, Victorian times, the houseplant was born in Victorian times.
Yeah, like where did people get their plants?
Well, you got all these plant explorers. You got all these explorers bringing plants back. I think they brought more than just chocolate and vanilla, potatoes and tomatoes. They must have. I mean, I can only imagine these ships being filled with all these really interesting plants. Joseph Banks was a plant explorer, and he inspired Darwin. The HMS Beagle. I mean, there's 8 weeks worth of stories of explorers, right? Like this dude in Kazakhstan decides to go to the Netherlands and brings his tulips with him. That's how the tulips got in Netherlands. They're not native in the Netherlands. So, yes.
Thanks so much for talking about the importance of technology over time.
Yes.
You sort of mentioned something when you talked about the herbariums, about I never want to see this go away in the digital age. I'd love to hear you riff a little bit about technology now and how you see that affecting horticulture in the future.
Well, I think two things. One, wow. I think technology is great. On my phone, I have like 6 apps for Plant ID, okay? And every one, if you read the fine print, says 80 to 82% success, okay? That's hard to take that to the bank. And most of those plant apps they don't get all the way down to cultivars. So that means I still have work to do. I remember when the first landscape design software came out, everyone was like, oh boy, we can design our own landscapes. But at some point you still have to choose. Even if you get that computer to generate a list of, hey Siri, tell me the most 12 popular shade tolerant herbaceous perennials. Now I'm going to get 12. Now I have to pick them. How am I going to pick them? Well, you get online and you read about each and every one of them. Before, I used to open up the book, the herbaceous perennial book, and I'd read about it. So there's still, technology just helps us do what we still have to do, and that's the work, I think. The reason I said that about the herbariums is because I'm a traditionalist. It's like I can't imagine just having a digital record of a plant and not actually have a plant that was pressed. But I was a kid growing up putting leaves in books, right? So I think just like social media is something very, very potentially good, it has a whole bunch of things that'll just take away from its value. And I think it's the same kind of thing with their tools. And sadly, I think we forget their tools. I still have to put the tool in my hand.
And there's a lot of misinformation. As master gardeners, we have to tell people all the time, cite EDU, right?
Got to really be careful because, digital media, social media does not go easy on gardening because it's gardening. It doesn't go any easier than any other subject where you get a lot of fake information. I tell my students they have to write a paper about a plant that they picked that's horticultural. And I tell them, don't just do AI because AI hasn't really learned enough about horticulture to be able to give you, good information. Ask AI, get something, but then edit it based on what the science says about it. And interestingly enough, now you can get online and read the science and you can read the sensation. And then you still have to decide which one you're going to believe. And that's hard because if you look hard enough, you're going to find out, I can't believe I'm going to say this. If you look hard enough online, you're going to see scientific studies that support the idea that glyphosate causes cancer. Roundup, what used to be Roundup, okay? You will also find just as many articles of research that's been done that say it doesn't. So now what are you going to do with that? You have to make a choice, right? And I hope we don't let it divide us like other things have divided us. Seriously, yes?
I just want to put a plug in for Duke Gardens. They have occasionally they'll have a class run by Scott LaGreca on how to prepare specimens for herbarium. And I actually took one of those classes, and I have in my house a frame of a fern that I mounted prepared for herbarium. So you can still do that.
The real, and one last thing I want to say about the binomial system is if you understand how to do it, if you understand it and you embrace it, then you will be able to interpret all the erroneous names that are out there. Seriously, what it does is it teaches you to recognize something that's written incorrectly, and you know what it is because you understand what the actual correct way to do it. So sometimes it's not so much that you do it because it's better as much as it's going to save you from, you'll be able to see, because most garden centers are, and most labels, many labels in garden centers, maybe you're about 60% binomial system, pure binomial system. And then what happened? 20 years ago, what happened? We got genus, species, we got varieties, we got cultivars, and now we have trademark names. Where did those things come? Poor Linnaeus's elbows are all bloody because he's been turning over in his grave ever since trademark names came. Why? Because trademark names sell plants better to people. Yes?
Well, I just follow up on one of the questions over there about pioneers bringing plants into an area. And NC State with the Jesse Ralston Arboretum, you always hear about how he has developed and the plants that's there.
Yep.
So,
yeah. It was my last slide in about 20 minutes. In 1976, and actually quite appropriate, in 1976, J.C. Ralston was hired as a faculty member at NC State University to work with the nursery industry. In 1975, if you went to an independent garden center to buy a woody plant, tree, shrub, vine, or ground cover, you had 46 different species you could choose from in 1975. So JC in 1976 asked for a plot of land on one of our research farms, and he said, I want to collect plants from down the road, from across the pond, from all over the places. I want to bring them here. I want to grow them like homeowners grow them. And I want to evaluate them for their suitability for growth here in the southeast region of the United States. That is still the mission of the J.C. Ralston Arboretum. We're a research institution. We're also an outreach. Okay, it's a public garden, but it's also a living laboratory. We teach classes there. So J.C. just started collecting plants, brought them here, grew them, evaluated them, and then once he saw a plant that had potential, he shared them without condition. That's the difference between then and now. Everybody's trying to patent the nuke discovery, so you can own the growing rights for it. No, J.C. just gave them away. Nurserymen would come, they'd be allowed to take cuttings of plants. Now, the good news is we have some great plants in the landscape that he brought here and introduced. The bad news is we have some plants that we had to get rid of that he brought here and introduced. Leyland cypress. It was going to be the answer to all our fast-growing evergreen woes, only to recognize the fact that it's incredibly susceptible to storm damage and is inundated with bagworms. It was the worst thing we could have done was bring that from the West Coast here, right? So all the Leyland cypress that used to be planted at the Arboretum, they ain't no more. They're just not there. So yeah, but the Arboretum still has a strong commitment to that. Can I do a selfless plug or selfish plug? Okay. Starting in July, I'll be teaching a course called Gardening in a Changing Climate. It's a 6-week class on how we as gardeners can understand what's happening in our climate and what we can do and not do to help and handle that situation. So if you go to the Ralston Arboretum website and you go on the calendar of events, you can look down in July and you'll see that there. And we teach classes. The class is a face-to-face and a live Zoom. So if you don't want to leave your home here to go to Raleigh to do that, you can actually tune in and watch it as well. And we record it. I've got people taking the class. They never show up on Zoom. They never show up to class. Going, what's going on? They paid the money? What are they doing? And I got this call from a guy saying, man, I loved your class. I said, I don't recognize you. He said, oh no, I took the class, but then I just watched all the recordings one weekend. I got binge watched. It was awesome. The class got, but we have this new educational model. Okay, to your point, Javin, right? You've got this thing, you've got this recording now that some people find helpful. So how cool is that? Thank you. I don't take your attention for granted. I appreciate the fact that you stayed locked and loaded for 2 hours. Carter, there you are. Thank you both. And thank you, Ashley, for the invitation. Appreciate it, y'all.